I won't dwell too much on the research Worldwide Works does, but it covers the internet, mobile technologies, ICT among NGOs, SMEs, and then website benchmarking against best practice. 2009 was an earthquake in internet access and telecommunications in South Africa. We had dramatic events. We had the divorce between Telkom and Vodacom. We had the failed marriage between MTN and Bharti. So lots of couple counseling having to go on last year. And we also had the landing of the Seacom cable. So finally we were coupled to the rest of the world without Telkom's intervention. Finally, competition between Telkom's access to the world and the rest of the industry's access to the world. That kind of earthquake ultimately leads to a tsunami, as we well know. And the tsunami is with us in 2010. It's swamping business models, it's swamping pricing models. MWeb announced uncapped ADSL a few weeks ago, which really set the cat among the pigeons. We also found the bigger ISPs trying to reshuffle their business models while trying to convince the market that uncapped ADSL didn't actually mean anything. For ordinary consumers, it means everything. But that's for those who are connected. Just very quickly, the implications of what's happening in 2010 and also the next few years. Firstly, at the end of 2008, the total capacity to the world from South Africa was 80 gigabits per second. Now, that might not mean a lot until you see the increase in capacity in bandwidth that's coming over the next few years. End of last year, it was 1.6 terabits per second, 20 times what we had a year before. End of this year, 5.4 terabits per second, 3 or 4 times what we had last year. And then end of next year, 14 terabits per second, almost 3 times as much as the end of this year. So we're seeing exponential increases in the extent of bandwidth to the rest of the world. And that's what's creating the tsunami that we're experiencing at the moment. That's what's changing all the business models. And that's what means you shouldn't sign up to any long-term contracts right now. By the end of next year, we'll have 150 times the capacity we had at the end of 2008. And that has to change everything. One of the things that's changed dramatically already is the number of access providers. And this also helps to push down prices. The more competition, the more providers, the lower the costs, and not necessarily the better the services, because right now it's a bit of a wild west. In the last year, we saw an 18% growth in providers of access, and we already had a lot of providers. This shows you a very quick picture of the growth of broadband in South Africa. End of 2008, ADSL, something like 550,000 connections. That's the end of 2008. End of 2009, last year, 630,000 ADSL connections. Healthy growth, but then you look at wireless broadband connections. End of 2008, 540,000 behind ADSL. End of last year, 930,000, growing dramatically. There's one reason for that growth, and that's competition. There are something like 3 or 4 providers of wireless broadband in South Africa, I mean serious providers right now to the consumer. There will be 5 or 6 by the end of this year. There's still only one provider of ADSL, so no wonder wireless broadband is overtaking ADSL. You might have heard of the ADSL provider. It's called Telkom. And Telkom have been ensuring that competition in that arena has been stifled. But it's not in their best interest either, because they can't keep up with the demand for the service, and their pricing model is based on what people pay for the rental of that ADSL line, not the usage, but the rental. So the rental keeps going up, and it keeps keeping those who are not connected out of the internet arena. But despite their best efforts, growth continues. End of last year, 1.5 million South Africans were broadband users. And I'm not talking about in the corporate environment. I'm talking outside of the office. I'm talking about in the home and on the move. 1.5 million South Africans. The sad thing about this, though, is that all of those were previously users of dial-up connections. And you can see from this graph that dial-up connectivity in South Africa is following a classic technology product adoption curve, which means it starts slow, climbs very steeply, reaches a plateau, and then drops very suddenly. And we're in that sudden drop. But it's not because people are being disconnected as much as people are migrating to broadband. But it's the haves. If the have-nots were moving up the value chain, up the broadband or connectivity food chain, you would see dial-up continuing to climb as the have-nots take on dial-up and then gradually move on to broadband. But in fact, dial-up is a very expensive technology once you start using it. So it's not appropriate to bring the have-nots into dial-up. They've got to be taken straight into broadband. And the cost of broadband remains completely prohibitive. Just a couple of news flashes that emerged from our research. More people now access the internet from small businesses than from corporate networks. And that's because of ADSL. So ADSL has made a dramatic impact on connectivity. The cell phone as a primary form of access, and that means someone only accesses the internet from their cell phone, has now passed dial-up in South Africa. And over the next 5 years, the big growth will come from the cell phone and from academic usage, especially through schools projects. Most schools projects in this country have failed, but if we look at the example of the Western Cape, Project Kanya has connected something like 800,000 school kids. At this stage to computers, not quite yet to the internet, but those 800,000 over the next few years will be internet users. And once their model is adopted by projects like Gauteng Online, we might actually see the R1 billion spent in Gauteng Online resulting in people actually using the internet and actually being online. This is what the graph looks like of actual internet usage. And you can see that last year, 2009, was the year of takeoff in South Africa. That's the year of the internet earthquake, when we finally saw the growth of the internet user base in this country starting to look healthy again after years of being completely flat. And it's not going to stop growing. All the new cables that are arriving are like a sluice gate. As I mentioned earlier, we are seeing almost exponential growth in bandwidth to the rest of the world. And that capacity has to be used somewhere. A new national fiber grid is switching on in the course of this year. MTN and Neotel have joined forces to lay down a national grid. Smartphone penetration is starting into the mass market, especially with the likes of, and I shouldn't be doing a product punt here, but the BlackBerry Curve is suddenly available on the most basic packages. And that's a smartphone that's got almost the capacity of the best smartphones on the market, even the iPhone. And today's learners are going to lead the growth as they come into the overall market. So let's look forward 10 years to 2020 and the vision for 2020 that's been expressed by our government. On last Tuesday in Parliament, the Minister of Communications in his budget speech made one very rash statement, probably a foolish statement, but if he can actually deliver the goods, this is the kind of vision that we would all want to see for South Africa. Universal access by 2019. That's the goal of his department. Is it possible? Well, let me show you some numbers. These are our projections for growth for the next 5 years. The blue bar is 2010, this year. We expect to reach 6 million internet users in South Africa, and that is a conservative forecast, because based on the growth that we saw last year and the year before, we in fact expect that to be even higher. But to be a little conservative, call it 6 million. And if that growth continues over the next 5 years, then by 2015, we should reach the 10 million mark of internet users in South Africa. And this is conservative, but optimistic. Now, bear in mind what this means. 10 million internet users in South Africa. What penetration does that represent? It's 20% of the population. Still a very, very long way off from universal access. 4 years beyond that, we might reach 30%. Certainly no more than 40% penetration. So serious things have to happen. There have to be major interventions, public-private partnerships, real commitment to the idea of universal access from the large service providers, the telecoms operators, and from government. What this 5-year forecast means for the 2019-2020 expectation of universal access is put into greater context when we look at something called the experience curve. This is a model that we've developed and identified over the past decade that shows that it takes the average user around 5 years to become comfortable enough and familiar enough with the internet to start using it actively and interactively. Chat roulette, for example. I do believe that's the biggest waste of time developed on the internet since IRC about 15 years ago when people first discovered chat. But it's also a great barometer of people's comfort with using an advanced application of the internet. But you're not going to see chat roulette amongst newcomers to the internet in South Africa until they've been online for at least 5 years. So take the 5 million people who are online now. In 5 years' time, those 5 million people will be using chat roulette or shopping online or creating their own blogs, becoming citizen journalists, etc. And the 10 million who are online in 2015 will only be ready for the likes of interactive applications, online, commerce, etc. by 2020. So in 2020, even if we have 40% or 80% of the population on the internet, we'll still only have 20% who are experienced enough to be able to take full advantage of the internet. And what this tells us very clearly is that experience on the internet and in ICT generally equals participation on the internet. In fact, until I had to put my thoughts together for this presentation and put it in the context of the age of participation, I hadn't thought of it that way. But it struck me very forcibly that to participate in the internet economy, you also have to be experienced in the internet economy. And this is what the experience curve looks like, which is simply taking the internet growth curve and pushing it back 5 years. So you can see, for example, in 2001, there were 2.8 million people online in South Africa, but only 350,000 of those had been online for 5 years or more. So companies were throwing tens of millions of rands. Now I can name names. Woolworths spent 40 million rand on In the Bag in 2000 and 2001. Standard Bank spent 60 million rand on bluebeam.com. Liberty Life spent another 60 million rand on My Life at Liberty, My Life at bluebeam.com it was called. They tried to combine various unworkable applications with each other and throw them at these poor 350,000 people who barely could afford to go online. Now they had to spend all their money on these sites. It was no surprise that those investments failed horribly. We've actually got a list of the top 10 failures from that period. All sites and services that spent more than 10 million rand targeting the small group of people, thinking they were targeting the bigger group of people. And that's the lesson that the experience curve really teaches us, which is that you can't target all the people who are online today. And we have to learn that lesson in terms of projects like literacy, numeracy, etc. If you're targeting people on the internet, the newcomers to the internet are simply going to fall outside of your target market. And this is what the experience curve looks like going forward to 2020. And in this slide, I call it the participation curve because these are the numbers we have to understand if we look at participation in the internet economy. And looking at the year 2020, we see that the 10 million people who are likely to be online by 2015, only then will in fact be participants in the internet economy. So 2019 vision, let's see what's the number for 2019, around 9.9 million people, probably close to 10 million people will have been online for 5 years or more by 2019. So even if the minister does achieve his objective, if he's still in office, of course, and 40 million people are online in 2020. Of those 40 million, only 10 million people will in fact be participants in the internet economy. Only 20% of South Africans will have joined the age of participation. And the clear lesson from that is, firstly, the future of the internet has already passed, because Today's age of participation for internet users represents something like 3.5 million people, not the 5.3 million who are online, but the 3.5 million who've been online for 5 years or more. And if we want to bring all internet users and all South Africans, for that matter, into the age of participation, we can't have 5-year plans or 10-year plans. The agenda for participation must begin now. There has to be a sense of urgency about connecting South Africa. It mustn't be treated as a luxury. It mustn't be treated as something that can come later. It's got to come now if we want all South Africans to benefit from it by 2020. Thank you very much.